Hello, my name is Jaye Viner. I'm a speculative fiction and romance author. I'm here to talk to you today about writing and my new book, Elaborate Lives, which came out in April 2023. That's right, that is actually this year. Wow. Feels like we're in a science fiction novel. I'm writing the wrong genre. Elaborate Lives is about the daughter of Hollywood celebrities who is trying to avoid becoming a trophy wife, as she feels predestined to become, by studying to be a psychiatrist instead. And rather like a Jane Austen novel, there's a lot of surprising social pressure and angst and obstacles thrown up in her way, including the ones that she puts up herself, with her own foibles and insecurities and ideas about how she should be. Um, and they all just kind of stand in her way. And when we enter the novel, she's been trying for a long time to try and achieve her ideal version of life, and is really exhausted trying to push back against everyone who thinks she should be something else. Um, the plot of the novel is very much romance. So, out of desperation, she is entering into, we'll say, a contractual relationship with one of her uh, patients, who's a film director, and he wants to increase his celebrity visibility. So basically, networking in Hollywood. And since she has all those connections, it makes sense for him. It's a little bit less clear how pretending to date him makes sense for her, and it kind of reflects her mental state to some extent that she thinks this is a good idea. Because it isn't quite, or it's a very short term solution to her problems, where she asks him to stage a couple photo shoot dates, as you see in the tabloids at grocery stores, coming out of Rodeo Drive. So it looks like they're dating, and then she takes it a step further and asks him to come pose as her date to her friend's wedding. And we know how those go, but this is a little bit more elevated than that. Um, I was inspired to write this book after reading Melissa Febo's memoir, Whip Smart, which is definitely not quite a romance, and it's definitely not a glamorization of anything related to dominatrixes or BDSM, which is the way that Larissa, the main character of this book, decides to kind of relieve stress and is some way enacting her only true self incognito in dungeon clubs. So she's got, her celebrity persona, her psychiatrist, doctor persona, and then this secret life, which I really wanted to explore because I was stunned by the way Melissa Febos exposed and really explored all the nuances of these desires that people have that aren't really considered mainstream and in fact are very much maligned and considered dangerous or questionable or unhealthy. And that memoir, if you've read it, is extremely complex, and her position in relation to her job as a dominatrix changes dramatically during different life stages over the course of that book. And I was just fascinated by that, and I thought it should be a novel, as I often do when I read a nonfiction book, and I think, oh, why are we wasting time here with memoir? Because it's a different kind of thing. And I think fiction gives us more options to explore the same ideas, but without the limitations of trying to be true to a real person. And in that way, sometimes we find different versions of truth or even larger truths when we have the freedom of fiction. And I really wanted to write a story about and exposing readers to those kinds of sexualities and those kinds of desires that most of us still think are really questionable and, if at the very least, weird. So that's why I wrote this book. I don't know if that's a great reason for writing a novel. Um, I was coming off of my debut novel, Jane in Battery Park. It was a pandemic debut out of Red Hen Press. Um, this book did not do very well, mostly because of pandemic and things related to it with shortages and on all that. I had the great pleasure of seeing it. Actually, the only time I've seen it in a bookstore, at the Boulder Bookstore, and I definitely did a fangirl moment and took all my social media pictures of the spine next to a very famous book, and that was awesome. But this is also a Hollywood novel. It's technically romantic suspense, but it's a literary novel, and I thought it was much more serious. And after that, I was going to leave Hollywood behind, and I was done with that. And I was going to write speculative fiction, and life was going to be dramatically different from my career. And so I found this story on accident. And there's a couple of things. When I was doing research for Battery Park, I read a lot of celebrity memoirs, especially with Carrie Fisher, Rob Lowe, and then also Tab Hunter, were especially influential for that novel. And I kind of stayed in that world reluctantly because I found this idea of performance and social expectations so compelling. And it's obvious that happens in Hollywood, where you have a larger than life reputations and whatever kinds of celebrity uh, become different versions of themselves uh, out of out of necessity. And I think that that's also part of human nature. And as we're working in society, even as regular people, we have different versions of ourselves and we perform in different environments to whatever extent. I'm always fascinated by people who, even for this book tour, one of the reviewers was asking people, do you feel like you pretend or you perform for people? And everyone was like, no, I'm my genuine self all the time. And I was like, well, what does that mean to be a genuine self? Because very few places in the world allow for genuine selves unless you are a quiet, very polite person naturally. And I don't know that anyone actually is, but we've learned that. And most people, are the most socially acceptable people, have learned to adapt several different versions of themselves based on what they know is appropriate in different environments, how they are expected to behave, or what they want out of a situation. And I think that's a fascinating thing about humanity and how we are constantly adapting, or sometimes when we fail to adapt. And so when I was looking at what was coming next, I had been exposed to the romance genre. And I was really fascinated by the fact that it sells based on tropes. And so I started collecting them, and I was like, well, what tropes could I play with? And I just literally made a list, and this is how I started this book. And I kind of played with it for a month or so, and I decided that this was going to be fake dating, because I thought that was really strange and wonderful and goes with my obsession with performativity. And I was going to do forced proximity, because that sounds really terrible, but it's actually something that turns people on. If you think of My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, the scene where they're trapped in an elevator, and how that plays with the trope of, well, somehow you fall in love while you're stuck in an elevator. And it didn't quite work out that way then, but that was the expectation that they were playing with. And there's a lot of books written like that. So I was like, okay, well, so what environment, what situation could I use these two tropes? And so I built off of a long, long adolescence of the great 90s age of romantic comedies, from Meg Ryan to Julia Roberts to Sandra Bullock. And I pulled all the things that I really love about those things, those movies, and I created this situation of a patient dating his psychiatrist, who isn't actually a psychiatrist, but actually a famous person in school to be a psychiatrist. And that's basically where it came from. So I had my celebrity research already done, but then I had developed a list of questions that I felt I needed to answer about Larissa's chosen profession as a psychiatrist. So I read several books, not just about psychiatry in general, but the practice of being a resident and resident in training, and what that life was like and what the schedule was like, and then began to embellish dramatically for my own purposes based on those loose schedules. So one important thing to note, and there's a note in the beginning of this book, is that I did not write Larissa as a good example of how to be a mental health professional. In fact, I would say that she is not honest enough with herself to know that this is not a good idea, but she's doing it because of where she's coming from, and out of desperation, essentially. This is what made sense to her. And she really values helping people. And I think she's good at helping people, just not in an ethical medical way. So a lot of people think that that's really exciting. They like watching professional people do terrible things, or be vaguely unethical, kind of like watching House. So if you like that, this is a great book for you. If you don't like that, it might drive you absolutely bonkers to read this and go like, oh, she should be arrested. And it's not abusive or anything, but it plays with this idea of what people do when they think they have the right answer, but don't quite have the right answer. And they're surrounded by people who are generally not as educated or not as informed about the situations as they are. So there's no one to go in and speak truth to them. And in book two, which I'm working on right now, it comes out in July of 2023. There is beginning to do some truth talking, and Larissa's friends, she has a group of sorority sisters who have stuck with her since college, begin to actually stand up to her and endanger the friendship of being with a cool celebrity by actually telling her that her version of being friends through therapy is not so great. So that's something you can look forward to. It's been quite a trip. I don't know if I could say that it's great to think about that conflicts of a romance novel and then also very serious mental health issues. But I think that what's great about romance is that it has so much flexibility, and then you can kind of pick and choose what parts you pull in, and then you can elevate the story based on what other things you mix into that standard romance. So that's what I did. We'll see if it was a good idea or not. Time will tell. So I'll tell you a little bit about my writing process, which is maybe not a great example of a writing process. So I'm a lot like Larissa in that you don't look to me for examples of how to be a writer, and you don't look to her to be a good psychiatrist. But we mean well. And I do teach writing at various conferences, but I don't normally tell them about my process because it's not a good place to start. So there's the preface of, well, let's see how this goes. I usually pre-write or I think about whatever stories for at least a month before I'm doing any kind of literal words on a page. So with this particular book, like I said, I was thinking about romance and I began to ask these questions of, well, what tropes would I want to play with? And what would the story be from those? And I literally just picked what was most interesting and went from there. And then I pulled in pieces of the Battery Park world that I had developed for my debut novel and had fun kind of putting in the Easter eggs for people who had read both books, and they could kind of have essentially was a fantasy world, except that this is contemporary Hollywood. So I spend all that time writing, and I have library receipts with notes all over my house, which is not a good system. I'm trying to put things in my phone, but it's so small, and I don't tactilely read. And I begin to think about what kind of story it is, which is not a genre question. It's a question about what the themes are. And so this I knew was going to be a book about two people who were not just falling in love with each other because it's a romance, but they were also learning something about themselves. And I think I probably always do that because of my obsession with performativity. There's always this question about, well, how does a person be comfortable with who they are? So I want to explore that and have the relationship aspect be a way of them learning more about themselves, which I think is a great thing about relationships. And it's a little bit sad that I am now very securely married and will not have this experiment ever again, probably, hopefully, of going out and falling in love with someone and then taking in all of their life experiences. I'm a little bit like a parasite in that way, where it's an educational experience. And I think that's a great way to learn about yourself and explore the world. So I think about all of those questions about, is this a story where we're going to explore the nature of knowing, so self-knowing, or is it going to be nature about family dramatics and getting along with your mother after a certain age when she's disappointed in you? So once I answer that question about what kind of story it is I'm telling, usually that answers the question about structure, because when you have the idea of what story it is, there are certain things that have to happen. And so if the emphasis is on the relationship with the mother, which I chose not to do, although there's elements of that, then from page one or chapter one, there's some development of this is the story we're telling, and the mother should be a pretty prominent part. And so because this is a story about these two people, I knew that it was going to alternate points of view. So we have chapters for Larissa and then chapters for the film director she dates, fake dates, whose name is Quinn, and that those rotate based on what the needs of the story plot wise, and that they were going to spend a lot of time internally exploring how they were relating to each other and relating to the various obstacles in their professional lives. And then I knew that based on the tropes that I had chosen, there were going to be certain things that had to happen from the plot. And so then the question was how to integrate those two pieces of, these are things that happen in the story, and these are things that happen in the plot. I know those words are technically synonyms, but they're two different things in my mind. Where one is the actions that serve the romance genre, and then one is the story, the character stories that serve the themes, the substance of the novel, essentially. And I don't start writing until I know the first part, and so sometimes that's just the first chapter. Although usually it's much more than that. I usually have the first 5 or 6 chapters in my head, which is the first section of the story. So usually just after what we consider the first act or the introduction, where you've had established your characters and you've established some kind of conflict, even if it's not the main conflict. And the reader generally has some kind of sense of what kind of thing they're doing, they're reading. And then I go off from there. And if I have spent enough time thinking about that, I usually write very quickly, and usually I've constrained the potential story arc down enough that as I'm getting into the middle section and into the end, there's only so many ways that are plausible for it to go. So I just write very quickly. And usually the only thing that keeps me from finishing a draft in 5 to 6 weeks is the pain I have in my fingers from sitting and typing. So that's how I do it. I've been told that that's not very normal, especially for someone with a full-time job, but it's very fun and exciting, and I like it a lot. I'm very happy with my personal writing process. It shows well. Okay, I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to try and speed this up because we're coming out of the pandemic and I had pandemic debut. I want to talk about a few of the books I read during the pandemic. I did a lot of reading because there wasn't much else to do. And unlike a lot of people, I didn't hit a slump. I actually did a lot more reading than I had in past years. So I made a list because there were so many. And I was like, well, I'm just going to keep rambling, and if I don't, just write them down. So these were the highlights. The first one is The Gold Persimmon by Lindsay Merribaum, which is also a 2021 debut from a small press, and it's feminist horror that takes place in a hotel, and it's very much a study in sociology and psychiatry, all of those things. We have people trapped in a high stress situation. I'm not going to tell you what kind of situation, but it is a horror novel. And they're all looking out the windows and seeing society unravel. And then as you're looking inward at the hotel, also things begin to unravel. It's great fun. It's a very short read. You'll love it. And then I read Archive of Alternate Endings by Lindsay Drager. It was also a very short book, and it's woven timeline based on all of the appearances of the Halley's Comet from Earth. It's fantastic. I don't really know how else to describe it, except that there's retellings of Hansel and Gretel involved. And let me say without ruining it, there's a very nice turn at the end, which sold it on me. It's just absolutely fantastic. We might even use the word genius. If you're not curious now, then I can't sell it. Can't tell you what it's about otherwise. So try it. And the third one, oh, I've got four. So 3 for 4. On the lighter side, and if you like more traditional books, Lady's Formula for Love is I think the first book in a series that's gaslight romance. If you don't know what gaslight romance, it's people that wear corsets, so Victorian and the gaslights, in London, but they fall in love, presumably in a very chaste sort of way, as they're Victorians. But it involves lady scientists trying to exist in Victorian London, and it's absolutely fantastic, especially when they try and interact with men who think they know better. And the last one, which is also an experimental novel, and I happen to own this one, Skin Elegies by Lance Olson, and it is also a braided timeline. You can see how I bent all the pages where I wanted to remember the writing. I love this book for the writing, and when I read it, it gave me a panic attack on an airplane because one of the timelines involves the Challenger explosion. It was very intense, but the writing is absolutely fantastic. So I destroyed all these pages because I wanted to mark all of these little places where you pull out like these gems, really beautiful writing or just analogies that were so precise, but also so skewed from what we would normally say. It follows several different timelines that are kind of meditations on human nature and society, how we do or do not work and operate. within spheres of violence. So this is probably not for everyone, but I thought it was absolutely amazing, and it's a mastercraft class in writing. So okay, that was my very very long recommendation. You would be amazed that I got it down to 4, 5. Okay. Is there anything else tell you about my book? There's so many things I could tell you. I also made a list of these, but I'm going to cut some of them. As by now you are very tired of listening to me talk to you on your small device. So as a teacher of writing, I think that reader expectations is one of the most important things to think about. And readers can think about this also, in that when you come to a book, even if you're not aware of it, you have certain expectations based on looking at the cover. So this book has very different expectations than this book. Is pink and so pretty. Uh, but they're not going to be the same audience, and they're definitely not going to be the same reading experience, right? And so I think what I would want people to come to thinking about Elaborate Lives, if you're going to read it, is to understand that it works on different levels. So you can read it as a romance novel. You can even read it as a clean romance novel, because the BDSM scenes, the sex scenes, there's only 3 of them, because I'm experimenting with that as a new kind of writing. And you can skip them and be totally fine and enjoy the characters, and it's very much about the characters. So in that way, it's got a lot more substance than a romance novel. And I think as the reviews have come in, like thinking about it as more of a women's fiction book, where you are thrust into this world that is very much larger than life Hollywood, but is also very close to how we're living now, where we have questions about how we can kind of fight back against a world that looks like it's dictating all of the rules to us, on every level, right? On politics, on economics. There's so much that feels out of control right now. And I think as I'm looking back on my writing process, that was really something that came out of this novel, is this feeling of both Larissa and Quinn having great dreams for their lives and really wanting to believe in the promise that they can make things happen for themselves. And what they find out is that's a lot harder than they've been told. Uh, and so this collaboration and this possibility of them working together to mutually achieve their dreams, and also get one over on all of the people that are kind of pushing them in other directions and killing those dreams, has become something of a cherished hope for me. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. So if you were going to read this book, that's what I would want you to know, is that it operates on a lot of different levels. And whatever expectations you have coming into it, you can kind of work those in to be kind of a reading experience that you want. And I will definitely not be offended if you skip certain things. It was written that way. There's a content warning that tells you how to avoid certain aspects of it. And I'm really proud of the way that it works in that sense. So you can have different layers of meaning, different experiences based on what you bring into it. Okay, so last thing, I will read you a brief excerpt, and then you can be done with me. The excerpt I chose to read is a date, but it's not a date between the 2 main characters. So as things happen in romance novels, Larissa and Quinn end up at the same restaurant on the same night, but they're with different people. At this stage in the book, Larissa is being set up on blind dates with her mother, who is really concerned that she's becoming this cold professional woman and that she's getting too old to be marriable, which sounds very much like Jane Austen, but still happens in real life. I definitely have felt that pressure, and I'm not even famous. So it's a scene where she's on a date and she sees Quinn across the room, and she does something that's a little bit brash and then gets her in trouble. After 2 drinks and not much of his dinner, Hassan was ready to talk about his ideal woman. She was, as expected, plus some physical embellishments Larissa found interesting. Round cheeks, both kinds of cheeks. Hair down to her waist, hairless everywhere else, even on her arms. None of this screamed deal breaker, though the idea of a man caring that much about little things made Larissa tired. But if I could hang on to him for 2 months, just until after the wedding, he'd make the right kind of impression I want to make, I thought. She'd never done such a detailed inventory of her ideal man, so When it became clear Hassan expected an answer in kind, she decided to describe not Hassan, which would have been wiser, but Quinn. Because why not? He was sitting there, a ready source of inspiration, and he was, though not handsome, physically interesting. I like someone a little aloof, she said, the quiet type who doesn't waste words, and when he speaks, it's like gold dripping from his lips. A little vampish, dark hair, white skin, maybe he even bleaches it. Extremely strong jaw that extends his face so I can fit my whole hand on his cheek when I slap him. Neat hygiene, but a messy look that reflects his wild soul. Across the room, Dansby was leaning in, finally getting comfortable, talking quite a lot, while Quinn sat as still as a living statue, taking him in. Larissa could practically feel his vibrating tension. Wait, was she jealous of Dansby? She bit her lip and wondered if Doan had found a solution to her voice recognition problem. Then she remembered that she'd promised her therapist, Dr. Bade, that she wouldn't see Quinn again at the club. You have very interesting taste, said Hassan with an uncomfortable laugh. Ideals never really end up being useful in real life. Larissa smiled sweetly, but not enough that Hassan was fooled. Yes, I understand that insults are part of American romance at a high level. That is why you have fundamentalists who are trying to make your people better, he said. Larissa blinked. She could feel her smile turning sour. She suddenly didn't have the willpower to fix it. Did he just compare me to... And then he continues, if you're referring to those terrorists who kidnap people and put celebrities on trial, the American Idol show trials, that thing you're talking about? She interrupted him. I think you misunderstood me. Unless you're trying to tell me you like sinful women. She said it like a flirtatious joke, but she couldn't quite pull it off. She was so irritated that he'd already revealed himself to be so basic. Well, I suppose this culture will take some getting used to. Hassan pushed away his frown. But I find you delightful. Really. He reached for her hand. I can't think of anyone I'd like to spend my evening with, except you. Larissa allowed him this touch, even though she'd already decided he wasn't a candidate for a wedding date. When enough time had passed, she offered to get him a fresh drink and made a strategic retreat to the bar. Across the room, Dansby was leaning into the table, his head propped up on his fist, looking at Quinn. Was his other hand busy under the table? She couldn't quite tell from Quinn's face. Probably half of him was turned and on, and half of him resented Larissa for being right about counseling him that Dansby was really a femme fatale, and that was going to solve his movie problem. She smiled herself as she thought, I just love it when people take my advice. And it confirmed what she'd decided about her life and her career. And no one was going to change that. No one. She returned to the table. She cautioned Hassan. The bartender likes me, so be careful. Your drink might be a little stronger than the others. He was instantly suspicious. Likes you how? Larissa tensed. That possessive note in Hassan's voice was such a turnoff. Seriously, they barely knew each other. It was the first date. So of course, her obvious answer was, we were seeing each other for a while, but a long time ago. Strategic pause. Larissa stirred her drink. My current boyfriend is over there. She motioned toward the column, being seduced by one of his actors. Hassan frowned. Then, before she knew what was happening, he'd seized her wrist and was dragging her across the room, right up to Quinn's booth. Is this your girlfriend? He asked. Dansby lurched back like a startled colt, wide-eyed, nostrils flared, still absurdly beautiful. But Quinn didn't even blink. He just raised those hard eyes up from the level of the table to Hassan's face. His gaze flicked from Hassan to Larissa. Back. His right eyebrow gave the smallest arch of an unspoken question, but he said nothing. I demand you release your claim on her. She's been unfaithful, and I will not associate with a woman who's claimed by another. Good luck finding a wife, asshole. Larissa wrenched out of his grip and stormed down the side aisle. One of Hassan's bodyguards rose as though to stop her, but she waved him back. Don't even, dude. I'm out of here. She did not look back to see what Quinn was doing. She told herself it didn't matter what he thought. So that's from the early to middle section of Elaborate Lives, you'll notice there's a question or a mention of fundamentalist terrorists, which are not real life terrorists. They're the ones in my first book. So there's very little interplay, but I do kind of treat them as though they're part of the same world. So a fictional version of Hollywood. And it's good fun. I highly recommend you check them out if you like something that's fast and easy to read. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you to the Boulder Bookstore. I really appreciate all you do for the community and for being awesome on Pearl Street. Have a good evening.